Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for everybody to giving up your Saturday evening to participate in what I hope will be a very lively discussion. I should try and keep what I want to say down to around 45 minutes so that we have plenty of time together to discuss what I hope to show you are a very important but a very complex set of issues. Let me begin with a quotation, almost exactly a year ago today. In fact, on the 27th of April 2021, the United Nations Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations. And her theme was the importance of confronting digital exclusion. Let me read an extract from her speech. As the world becomes more digitally dependent, it threatens to exclude those that remain disconnected. Almost half the world's population, 3.7 billion people, the majority of them women, and most in developing countries, are still offline. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted this disparity. While confronting the pandemic, those without internet access have been unable to benefit from remote education, remote work, or remote health. Without decisive action, the digital divide will become the new face of inequality. There's, of course, absolutely nothing to disagree with in that statement. She goes on to signal three problems that she feels need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. One is the structural fragmentation of the internet, the fact that we don't, in fact, have a World Wide Web. Increasingly, nation states are barricading themselves behind borders. The most obvious example of that, of course, is China, but to some extent now Russia, but other countries as well. So the idea of a global network is a fiction. But we need to break those barriers down because the importance of the internet is precisely that it transcends borders. A second issue has to do with the need to have closer collaboration between corporations and governments and civil society. And finally, very importantly, to address the abuse of discourse on the internet and the rise of conspiracy theories and hate speech. What's missing from that list is any real understanding or signaling of the profound relationship between the organization of the internet as it stands at the moment and the escalating climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we rush too quickly to applaud every new person who signed up to the internet, we have to ask two questions. What will they confront when they get access? And secondly, what is the environmental and social cost of that connection as it stands at the moment? Those are the questions I want to begin to unpack for you tonight. We'll only have time to really to scratch the surface, but I want to give you maybe some threads that I hope you will follow up for yourselves. Next slide, please. Let me begin with a quotation from Karl Marx. It appears, of course, in the first volume of Capital, where he declares what he's going to do in the book. And remember, he's writing against the background of a theory of political economy, which is dominated by the ideas of particularly Adam Smith, where capitalism was seen primarily as a system of markets, that the best way to organize a complex economy was through private enterprise and market competition. And a lot of what has happened since then has been an attention to that question. How does competition work? How do markets work? Marx wants to say, well, we need to take a step backwards to truly understand what's happening. He says we need to leave the noisy sphere of exchange and consumption, where everything takes place on the surface and in full view of everyone, and enter the hidden abode of production. You'll see that I've taken my title from that phrase. A lot of the research that's currently going on the internet is focused on that noisy sphere of exchange and consumption. We now know a lot about how people use the internet. We know quite a lot about how it's organized to seduce them into using it more intensively. And we increasingly know more about what the consequences of that activity are for the way people behave and the way they understand the world. But I want to follow Marx and take that journey backwards to look at the origins of the internet and what that tells us about its relationship to the current catastrophes that we're facing, both environmental and social. Next slide, please. We're living with a double and very visible catastrophe. We're living with the catastrophe of accelerated climate change and environmental destruction. That picture there is an elderly Greek woman standing in the street where she used to live, which is entirely eradicated by wildfires from last summer that swept across the whole of the Mediterranean in a way that no one had ever seen before. On the other side, you see a photograph from Seoul in South Korea of a young woman going about her business under the conditions of COVID. COVID is still very active in the world. It's still claiming very large numbers of fatalities every day. And we see almost every day the consequence of accelerating climate change. Mudslides, fires, droughts, everywhere in the world. Next slide, please. The statistics are not too complicated, but I've tried to summarize them here. What's happened is that both the Earth's temperature and the rate of deforestation, which are the two great triggers for what we're experiencing now, have accelerated, you'll see, have accelerated sharply in the last few decades, and particularly since 1980. You see those red columns there. They're shooting up at almost 45 degrees. And if you look at deforestation, you see again a sharp rise from about 1960 onwards, again shooting up. Both of these deep processes are fundamental to understanding why we're in the situation we are at the moment, for reasons we'll come to in a minute. Next slide, please. Why have these things accelerated so much from around 1980? Well, I want to argue that we need to begin by understanding that this is the moment when you see the beginnings of a turn to what we call marketization. That is, that you see around the world, for different reasons, a cumulative rejection of state ownership of resources, of state management, and a turn towards market forms of organization. You think in a space of less than a year, the three great economies of the post-war world that were uncoupled from the capitalist system, India, China, and the Soviet Union, all become part of that system almost within months of each other. The Soviet Union collapses. China, under Deng Xiaoping, decides to go towards the market, to introduce elements of capitalism into what was previously a very tightly controlled state organized system. And India, as you will know better than me, begins to embark on a process of privatization, welcoming inward investment and so on. So you see an enormous shift change in the global economic system. And you see one of the consequences of that is, for some people, rising rates of consumption. You have what has come to be called the growth of the global middle class, that families which were unable to afford a refrigerator or a car suddenly become able to think about having one. So you begin to get escalating consumption as people's aspirations rise and their incomes rise. Not everybody, remember, this is something we'll come back to. We also see over this period from then until now a massive ratcheting up of global inequality, where the lion's share of the gains from this marketizing process have gone to the top 1% of the population. But that has still left a large number of people in the middle. But it's not, you also see the intensification of consumption. You see people, and we'll come back to this in a minute, what I call hyperconsumption. That is, people are encouraged to consume more than they've ever consumed before, but also to throw things away more frequently than they ever had before. So you get this rapid turnover. And you also get a fundamental change in tastes. And one of those areas where that's most visible is in food. As we'll see in a minute, you get rising rates of meat consumption, unprecedented in human history. Both of those are contributing to the situation we find ourselves in a way I'll unpack in a minute. Next slide, please. One of the consequences of this rapid industrialization and acceleration of consumption has been increasing demands on energy. And unfortunately, the lion's share of energy that's being consumed is still fossil fuels. We're moving slowly towards some forms of renewable energy, but basically we're still in a situation where the vast majority of the world's energy is coming from fossil fuels. The fossil fuels are compacted deposits of carbon. And the three most important, of course, are coal, oil, and gas. And when they're burnt, of course, they give off huge amounts of energy. But you can see all three of them have been rising since the 1960s, and they still are. This is a catastrophe because this leads to what we have come to be called global warming. They release CO2 into the atmosphere that creates a kind of a blanket over the Earth, stops the heat from escaping back, and warms both the Earth and the oceans. And that's the situation we find ourselves in now. Next slide, please. You'll see that carbon dioxide accounts for about 3/4 of greenhouse gases. These are the gases that are creating the warming effect. But the other very considerable gas is methane. Methane is produced in a variety of ways, but one of the major sources of methane is cattle. It's cattle which are giving off methane. And the more we move towards cattle farming, the more methane we have. Next slide, please. And if you look at, again, you look at a long historical trend, if you look at the uses of habitable land, that's excluding mountains and bogs and things that you can't use very productively, You see that over time, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, about half of the world's habitable land is now used for agriculture. And almost just over 3/4 of that is used for cattle grazing and for growing animal feed. It's not used for growing crops that are directly feeding the population. It's primarily used for animals and animal feed. Next slide, please. Next slide. One of the most important habitats in the world is the Amazon rainforest. And if you look at the latest statistics that we have, in the year between August 2020 and July 21, the Amazon lost an area of rainforest 17 times the size of New York City. That's a colossal loss, and it has a number of fundamental effects. Forests, and particularly rainforests, are what we call carbon sinks. That is, they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and they convert it back into oxygen. So they basically purify the air and reduce global warming. So the more you lose forests, the more you reduce the natural barriers to global warming. But forests also, as we'll see in a minute, are habitats. They're very complex, particularly rainforests. Rainforests are the most luxurious habitat on the Earth's surface. They are the home to the majority of species, animals, birds, and insects that we have catalogued. The more that we destroy them, the more that we destroy those ecological habitats. And the more we drive species to the edge of the forest, where they have to seek alternative spaces, the more we bring them into contact with humans, and the more likely it is then that they will transmit what are called zoonotic diseases, of which COVID-19 is one. COVID-19 was transmitted by bats to an intermediate animal host, possibly a raccoon dog, is the latest research, and then onwards into the human food chain. So destroying forests is an actually fundamental problem, both for the climate, but also for the spread of pandemic diseases. Next slide, please. So that's all by way of context. We come to two very fundamental questions. What, if anything, has the economic and social organization of digital communications got to do with our current crises? And secondly, if it has, what should and can we do about it? Next slide, please. Next slide. I want to argue that there are two threads that we need to follow in understanding how digital communications is fundamentally implicated in both the corona and the climate crisis. First of all, we need to understand that in addition to being symbolic spaces and economic formations and social connections, digital communications are material formations. That is, they depend upon infrastructures and devices. Infrastructures are all the apparatuses that organize connecting networks, satellites, cables, aerials, and so on. And the devices of those machines that allow us to interface with those networks, laptops, cell phones, game players, and so on. If we look at that constellation of very material objects, what we see very clearly is, first of all, they are consuming scarce resources, they're using energy and they're creating waste, but they're often manufactured and transported under exploitative conditions. And those conditions drive multiple dispossessions, from the theft of indigenous land to the exploitation of unlicensed mariners working on the big container ships that ply the ocean. What was being dispossessed is not only physical resources, but opportunities and life chances, but also cosmologies. That we're taking away people's sense of themselves and forcing them to think about themselves in relationship to the second prime driver of this system, which is hyperconsumption. Digital communication is a massive, overwhelmingly now, a massive machine for promoting commodities. It's basically a giant advertising billboard that is designed to drive more and more extreme forms of consumption. And it does this, as we'll see in a minute, through saturation advertising and also frictionless payment, a very important part of what's going on. Next slide, please. Have a look at these carbon footprints. This is the amount of carbon that is used in the production and use of particular objects. You'll see laptops and smartphones are way out in front of the everyday objects that we use. They're incredibly environmentally destructive. But you also see, interestingly, up there, the other longish column is beef, hamburgers, which we'll come back to in a minute. Next slide, please. In discussions of how to address the climate emergency, corporate discourse is very often focused on persuading you to make changes to your everyday activity, to switch your machine off, not to use it overnight, and so on. Well, yes, that possibly will make a difference. But if we look at the iPhone, we see something very stark, that 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the production of the phone. They don't come. You are not making them. They have already occurred before you even get the machine out of the box. So the primary responsibility lies not with you as a consumer, it relies with those companies who are producing the phone and their chains of production. Next slide, please. And if we look at that chain, we see a whole series of moments. We see the extraction of materials, particularly metals. We see the metals that are used in silicon chips, for example, but also in batteries. We see systems of production and assembly, transportation, energy, disposability, and waste. So that when you pick up your cell phone, already inside it is a history of multiple forms of despoilation of the environment and exploitation of labor. You can't see them, and in fact, the publicity that surrounds these objects is deliberately designed to prevent you from seeing them. It's deliberately designed to get you not to ask that question. Where has it come from? And how much has it cost the environment and the people that have been involved in its production? And that We'll come back to this because it raises a very profound ethical question, that our privileges as users, for example, of a state-of-the-art smartphone are bought at the price of the dispossession of the poorest people on the planet, that we are complicit in that dispossession. Next slide, please. So let's look at some of these moments. First of all, resources. There's been a great deal of work on this, but unfortunately the situation remains fairly critical. One of the minerals that is essential still for making cell phones is coltan. Coltan is not found in very many places on the Earth's surface. One of those places where it's found in particular concentrations is the Republic of Congo. And despite a great deal of effort to rectify the situation, it is still the case that there are a number of child laborers scavenging in these open cast pits, extremely dangerous, extremely toxic, looking for any deposits of coltan that they might possibly be able to sell. So these are the first dispossessions. They're being dispossessed of their childhood, they're being dispossessed of their education, and because of the health problems, they're being dispossessed of their life chances. They're likely to die much sooner than they could have been had they had an occupation that was not so dangerous or so toxic. Next slide, please. Then we come to production and storage. Here are two. One is one of the Foxconn assembly plants. Foxconn makes the iPhone, and the other is an Amazon warehouse. We're used to thinking of digital communications as immaterial, as a series of pulses and signals that travel without any embodiment. Well, that's true to an extent, except that the devices themselves are extremely physical. They're packed into boxes and they're sorted in these warehouses, and then they're brought to you by probably a just-in-time van driver on the minimum wage. An extremely physical set of activities and extremely exploitative. It's only last week that Amazon was forced to admit a trade union representation in one of its warehouses in the United States. It has adamantly refused to allow its workers' collective bargaining rights to better their conditions, despite the enormous amount of evidence of fatal injuries, of psychological damage. The rhythms of work in an Amazon warehouse are as punishing as anything Marx observed in the cotton mills of 19th century Lancashire. We're going back to a Victorian situation. And if I'd have shown that picture to Marx, he would have immediately recognized it. That's exactly what a factory looks like. And these are exploitative workers. The workers in that Foxconn factory are primarily young women from rural areas who've been bussed in. They're kept in barrack-like lodgings, extremely restrictive conditions, and again, minimum wages. Foxconn caused a national sensation a couple of years ago when it put up nets around the roof of some of its production installations. These were nets to catch people who were throwing themselves off the roof to commit suicide because they were so distressed by their working conditions. The only other place that you have seen those nets, or you will have seen them if you're familiar with the history, were on the slave ships plying the Atlantic, because slaves were again a very valuable commodity. So the slave ships also had nets around to stop the slaves throwing themselves into the sea. Next slide, please. And then how do these things get to us? Well, they get to us primarily on container ships. Container ships are transporting about 80% of all the consumer objects that we consume in the global production chain. And you can see here very clearly, they've got bigger and bigger and bigger. And they're incredibly destructive. They're incredibly polluting of the oceans, but they're incredibly polluting of the ports that they dock at as well. They're a major problem for the oceans. One thing they do, for example, is they make a noise that disturbs the sonic radar of whales and porpoises and other animals, so they can no longer steer. One of the reasons you get a lot of whales now washed up on beaches around the world is because their echolocation system is totally destroyed. It's destroyed by the sound of those ships plowing through the ocean. Next slide, please. And then when we get it, what do? We overwhelmingly use it for surfing the internet and interfacing with social media sites. And it's always on, always there, 24/7. Next slide, please. So here you see a minute of the internet. These figures are from 2020, but they would not be, they'll be bigger now, but the ratios will be about the same. In 1 minute of the internet in 2020, there were 404,444 hours of video streamed by users and 500 hours of video uploaded. That's every minute of every day, 24 hours a day. Colossal amount of data. And video is very thick data. It's not like an email. It takes up a lot of space and it consumes a huge amount of energy in transmission. Next slide, please. And where does that data go? It goes to the cloud. And the cloud, again, is a factory-like installation, huge complex of computers that are storing your work. I still keep my work on an external disk drive. I can control what's on it and I can arrange it in any configuration I like. You're increasingly encouraged to send all your data to the cloud, managed, of course, by the big corporations, Google and so on. In order for that storage facility to work, it requires huge amounts of energy, but also huge amounts of water, because it has to be kept cool. The machines have to be kept cool. Some data companies have moved to Iceland or to Finland or to the Arctic Circle, but others are still in places like California. One of the reasons that California has a problem of drought is because a lot of the water that used to be used for other things is being decanted into these data centers. Next slide, please. And then we have the problem of obsolescence. Electronic waste, huge piles of waste, toxic pyramids of Egypt, of the modern world. And again, you see people scavenging there for things that can be recycled or reused. Again, very dangerous, very hazardous. We don't ever see those because they're pushed away to remote places that are off of our radar. But that's what happens to all of our unused or discarded or rejected machines. And as we'll see in a minute, we've been rejecting them at a faster and faster rate. Next slide, please. But it's going to get worse because we're on the edge of some very big new developments which are being greeted with incredible enthusiasm. The Metaverse, Mark Zuckerberg's favorite, artificial intelligence, and blockchain. Next slide, please. what Zuckerberg thinks of what is often called Web 3, that it will be a three-dimensional web. It will be a web you can walk into. You will have an avatar of yourself, and you can go to meetings and nightclubs or whatever you like. And there you go. You might, if you were incredibly unlucky, meet Mark Zuckerberg. I can't imagine anything worse. But there you are. This is his vision of the future, that you'll have this simulation of the world that you will be able to negotiate without really ever going outside at all. Next slide, please. But we could ask, can we afford the metaverse? I think the answer is no. One of the clues is this table here. If you look down to the third bar of orange, this is recording the electricity consumption of everyone playing games in California in 2021. And games, as you know, are getting more and more three-dimensional and more complex. Californian gamers, and California is one of the richest enclaves in the world, is consuming, these game players are consuming more electricity than Ghana, Costa Rica, Ethiopia, Kenya, El Salvador. Huge inequality of demand on global supply. So the metaverse is going to be a disaster in terms of energy consumption. And that's going to create all kinds of environmental pressures. Next slide, please. Or let's take blockchain. Blockchain, if blockchain was a country, it would be using more energy than a number of existing countries, including Argentina. Or look at that figure at the top. One blockchain transaction is the equivalent of 1.68 million Visa transactions. So again, blockchain is incredibly environmentally destructive. The more we go down that road, the more problems we're laying up for ourselves. Next slide, please. So that's the first chain that we need to confront. We need to confront the multiple materialities of digital communication and to ask ourselves, what are the environmental impacts of the way we organize digital communications? And what are the consequences for social justice and social equality? To sign on to the internet as it is at the moment is to sign on to a social and ecological catastrophe. That's why we need to change it. But we need to change it for another reason as well, which is that it's an engine of hyperconsumption. We're encouraged to buy more. We're encouraged to throw things away more quickly. And we're encouraged to think of ourselves primarily as consumers rather than citizens, to think of ourselves as able to have a fully realized life primarily through the things we buy. Next slide, please. The iPhone's a very good example of this. The original iPhone was launched in the summer of 2007. So in the space of 15 years, we've arrived at the 12th iteration of the iPhone. That's almost one a year. What happens to all those old iPhones? Well, they get chucked away. And the iPhone is a classic example of hyperconsumption. Hyperconsumption is based on telling you that what you have already is never going to be good enough, that the next one will always be better. It will always have something that you're missing, something you can't live without. a bendy frame, a new camera, fingerprint protection, whatever. So every time you're seduced into buying the next one and throwing away the old one. Catastrophe in ecological terms. Next slide, please. But it's worse than that, because the iPhone and all other smart devices have primarily become the way we pay for things. Think about it. If you pay for something with cash, you're counting it out, and you have time to consider what you're doing. You might think, oh, I don't know, £10, it's a lot of money. I'm not sure I really want to spend that. And you might reconsider and put the cash back in your pocket and walk away. But when you can just swipe, it's frictionless, it's painless. And of course you're going to buy it, because you don't even notice what you've done. We're now in the UK living at record levels of consumer debt. People owe huge amounts of money because they've been paying for things they couldn't afford. And they've been paying for them in a way that they didn't even notice how much money they were spending. This is deliberate. It's a way of accelerating consumption. And that's what the internet's for. It's to get you to do that. Next slide, please. And one of the ways it does that is to have all kinds of new forms of promotional activity. It used to be the case that an advertisement was a particular rhetorical system that was inserted into the newspaper, or inserted into the television program. And you could tell when the advertisement started and the program finished. Now you can't. You have a whole series of devices which integrate promotion into the flow of the pleasure you get from watching. And one of them is influencers. Amateurs usually, who are paid to talk up products. Here's one of the most successful influencers in human history, Ryan. Ryan started promoting toys as a 6-year-old child. He became the most successful YouTube influencer, earning more money than anybody else. But here he is promoting McDonald's. Next slide, please. And kids don't see that as an advertisement. They have a relationship to Ryan, and it's very seductive. But the consequence is a public health catastrophe. Look at these kids here. They're going to die in their 40s of diabetes, of cancer, of obesity, of all kinds of avoidable diseases. You're taking away their life chances. Next slide, please. And this is becoming a global problem. Between 1990 and 2050, you'll see that meat consumption is going to double from 34 to 68 kilograms per person per year. This is unprecedented in human history. Meat used to be, for many people, a luxury, something that was relatively rare. Now it's a necessity. Now it's a constant. But it's not just meat, it's fast food. It's meat processed in particular ways that inserted into the flow of everyday life. Next slide, please. But beef, which is, of course, the main ingredient of hamburgers, has an enormous carbon footprint. This is the greenhouse gas emissions of 4 ounces of various foods. You see, beef is way out. And you see that pulses and vegetables are way down. The more that we continue with ratcheting up a meat-intensive diet, the more problems we have, not only for greenhouse gases, but also for pandemics. Next slide, please. Here's another statistic. 2019, we lost every 6 seconds, somewhere in the world, a football-sized pitch of primary rainforest. A lot of it was in the Amazon basin, but a lot of it was also in Southeast Asia, countries like Indonesia. And most of that was for cattle and for palm oil and other forms of feed for animals. Next slide, please. And this is a problem because it's the breeding ground of zoonotic diseases, of which coronaviruses are one example. COVID-19 is a coronavirus in the same way that MERS was and SARS. All three of those coronaviruses were transmitted primarily by bats. Bats are the most plentiful species on the Earth's surface. There are more bats than any other species. And they're very good at carrying diseases without injuring themselves. And the more bats are driven out of their natural habitats, where they circulate within a closed system, the more that they come into contact with human habitation and to other forms of wildlife, the more likely they are to transmit a coronavirus into a chain that will reach your kitchen. And that's what's happened with COVID. So what can we do about it? Next slide, please. Well, if you don't know this book, there's a wonderful book by the radical feminist political economist, Kate Raworth, which I notice has been taken up in the United Nations. She calls it donut economics. And a donut is a cake, a cookie, and it's a round piece of sugary dough with a big hole in the middle. And she argues that the pale green area there is what she calls a safe and just space for humanity. In order for that to be sustained, two things are necessary. One is the ecological ceilings that keep us in a livable space have to be kept within. The more we overshoot them, the more we're reducing our chances. But the inner circle, the inner dark green circle, are the social foundations of livable space. And these are all of the social demands that have been on the table for a long time. So when we're designing any kind of policy now, we have to look at two things. We have to ask, what are the environmental consequences of doing this? But also we have to ask, is this going to advance social inclusion, social justice, and all of those social welfare goals that we're familiar with? If we look at the debate about communication policies, increasingly we don't ask either of those questions strongly enough. And I would argue that unless we do, we're going to be complicit in an unstoppable social and environmental disaster. Communications, as they move towards the center of organizing economic, social, and cultural life, become the crucial point of pressure. And therefore, as communication scholars, we have both an opportunity but also an obligation to ask for a communication system that is positive for the environment, but also positive for social justice. That we need to see communications as an intrinsic motor for sustaining that pale green circle in Kate Raworth's donut. Next slide, please. And we need to address the multiple dispossessions that lie behind the system that we are living with today. One of the most important is, of course, land. One of the biggest construction projects of recent years has been the Carmichael mine complex in Queensland, which is an open cast complex primarily for digging coal for the Adani Corporation. It has been possible only by the forced occupation of indigenous lands. This is a form of theft which has a long history in the history of empire. We're still taking away, still annexing, still cancelling land rights of indigenous peoples that have lived there for many, many thousands of years. Every day, an indigenous society is reduced and to some extent decimated by a demand for the materials that are needed to drive the system that we are creating. And this won't stop with so-called green technologies. This is very important. Green technologies, battery technologies are going to require rare metals. And those rare metals are located in some very specific places. So again, the struggle for land rights will become probably intensified in the future rather than ameliorated. And we have to ask ourselves, are we prepared to allow whole societies to disappear or to become so reduced in order for us to have a new gizmo on our smartwatch? It's not just a practical question, it's a moral question. Next slide, please. Another huge problem is growing displacement. Here's an estimate that we're going to see in what are called internal displacements, that's within countries, 143 by 2050. 143 million people will be internally displaced by the climate crisis. They will not be able to stay where they were born, where they lived, where they had their livelihoods. 200 million and up to 1 billion will have to migrate out of their national community. We're looking at the beginning of a gigantic displacement of people. And that's because of the fact that we're making so much of the Southern Hemisphere unlivable. Next slide, please. You can see that very clearly looking at these two maps. The first map shows the rate of CO2 emissions. And the bottom shows the projected change in livability. You see that the intensity of the redder the color, the more emissions. You see, with the exception of Australia, you see that the vast majority of emissions are in the Northern Hemisphere, in the privileged countries of the North. You see the vast majority of spaces that will become unlivable are in the Southern Hemisphere. So we have an enormous problem of global justice. Next slide, please. We also have a problem of generational justice. My generation, I'm not sure how old all of you are, but you're going to be leaving behind, unless we do something very, very fundamental, you're going to be leaving behind an unlivable space for your children and your grandchildren. And not surprisingly, the school strike for climate action recognizes that. They say, you have no right to take our future away. This is the biggest of all of the dispossessions. We are taking away people's right to a livable future. That idea that things will always be better for the next generation is gone. We now have to confront that they may be considerably worse. Next slide, please. So let me return you to Marx. Marx, towards the end of his life, began to think about these issues. And in the third volume of Capital, which he never finished, it was just a series of scribbled notes that were put together after his death. And we're not sure even if it's in the right order, but it contains some startling perceptions, among which is this one. Even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not owners of the earth. They are simply its beneficiaries and have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations. That remains our moral obligation, to bequeath it in an improved state. So what does that mean then for the kind of communication system that we're going to design for the future and for the way we evaluate what counts as a good society? Next slide, please. Well, I think we have to, imaginatively, we have to do two fundamental things. We have to think about a good society in a different way. At the moment, we measure the success of a society in terms of something called gross domestic product. That is the value of everything that's produced in the society. But it doesn't take account of the quality of life. You can have a very productive society and a very poor quality of life. Very obvious example, think of automobiles. You could have everybody in the society owning an automobile. That would push gross domestic product up into a very high figure. But if you couldn't wind the window down anywhere because of all the pollution, then what have you gained? So we have to think about aiming not for perpetual growth, but perhaps even for less growth, but better quality. And in order for us to understand that, we have to make another mental migration from thinking of ourselves primarily as consumers to thinking of ourselves as citizens. To say that the quality of our lives depends not only on our individual advantages and our individual possessions, but on the quality of the environment that we share with everybody else. We want clean air. We want clean water. We want basic energy that's affordable and is not environmentally destructive. And we want to enjoy a range of goods that are not purchased at the expense of the mass exploitation of invisible strangers. If we begin to think like that, then we need to ask some very serious questions about the way we organize communications. I have always been totally committed to two things. First of all, to very stringent regulation on commercial activity, to hold corporations to account for their social consequences. But that will never be enough because corporations will always manage to find some wriggle room. So the really fundamental challenge for us is to rethink public communication. If I'm right about the problem of hyperconsumption, we need to have an internet and we need to have a communication system where there's a substantial and attractive space which is advertising free. We need to create what I call a digital commons. We need to put together the two great cultural constellations that lie outside of the market. All those things that we do together collaboratively to create things for our mutual enjoyment without payment. Huge amount of activity going on at local level. But also all of those great public resources, the museums, the libraries, the universities, the galleries, the archives, all of that repository of knowledge and information, which has not yet been co-opted into the market, provides a huge resource for understanding and negotiating the world. So when we ask about solving the digital divide, getting more people connected, I want them to be connected with something that does not insistently instruct them to become consumers, but gives them access to a range of resources that lie outside the market, which have been collectively bequeathed by generations of activity and remain our public right, our public possession. So for me, the struggle is not only to close the digital divide, it's to create access to something different, something that is not going to be ecologically destructive and is not going to be socially exploitative. This is a colossal challenge. But as scholars of communication, it offers us a once in a lifetime opportunity to intervene in the debate in a way that is fundamental. If we don't, if we walk away, we will be complicit in destroying the planet and reinforcing what has come to be an unsustainable level of global exploitation. I hope you will want not to do that with your talent and your erudition, and you will want to try to join the struggle for something else. As the famous slogan has it, another world is possible, but we will have to define and help to define what it looks like, and we will have to struggle to make it a reality. Thank you.
Wonderful.
So there was just some suggestions. We can talk in more detail as if people want to ask questions. I'd rather hear from what people would like to know more about or the questions that they want to raise.